Is this good enough? That's a question that's going to come up constantly in a design and technology workshop. Hi, I'm Colin Klupik. In a previous video where I walked through how to make a single dovetail joint, I said right at the end that this particular joint actually benefits really well from the gluing, sanding, and finishing process because of all of the gaps and cracks that are inherent in the job. Now, was I actually saying that it's okay to make a joint with lots of gaps and cracks in it? No, that's not what I meant, which is why this follow-up video. But it also gives us a chance to address that question of, is this good enough? What I was actually referring to is that because this is an interlocking joint, there are lots of different faces that have to come together. And sometimes when you chisel things out, you actually take out chunks of timber. So you do actually end up with gaps or voids inside the joint. Now, that's just part and parcel of doing things by hand. And when you use, say, a router and a dovetail jig, the cuts are much more exact. In fact, you can fine-tune them to be almost perfect. One of the problems with that, of course, though, is that when you then go to try to glue the thing together, the fit is so good, it's so tight, that all the glue just kind of squeezes out of the joint. And then you think, well, hold on a second, how much glue is there actually in there? But because this is a hand-cut joint, you're always going to end up with that situation of, is this good enough? And that's something that students will struggle with all the time. So in this video, I'm going to actually glue this together, and then we're going to sand it and finish it and see how good that looks in the end. But throughout that process, we're going to answer that question, or at least try to address the question of how do you respond to a student when they ask you, is this good enough? Hi there, Future Colin here. Just a quick heads up. In this video, we'll look at a little bit of detail and also catch up on a couple of steps that we missed out in the first dovetail joint, and that might help to answer some of the questions that you might have. We'll also see that demo 1 actually ends up being not quite good enough, and we'll answer some questions as to why. But if you stick around to the end, you'll also see demos 2 and 3, which help to shed even further light on those questions and provide us with a really practical teaching resource to help students through that whole conundrum of, is this good enough and can I now move on? So, back to the other Colin. One of the things about gluing a joint together like this is that the glue can become a little bit drippy and messy. So to protect my workbench, I'm actually using an old piece of melamine. Now, that's not to say that a workbench shouldn't get messy and see the signs and history of work, but why get it unnecessarily messy if you can help it? So to help me put the glue on here, I'm actually going to use a basting brush. The reason why I use a basting brush is because of the nice silicone bristles, which makes it really easy to wash out, which is one thing you want to also keep in mind when you're trying to run a workshop. Cleaning. Make sure that whatever cleaning you need to do can be done very easily, and these work really well. So the thing to remember is when a student asks you the question, is this good enough? Well, that's the never-ending question really in a design space, isn't it? Is this good enough? Well, it can never really be totally good enough because that's just the nature of design. If things were good enough, then we would have stopped designing and innovating years ago. But the answer to the question is obviously no, it's not good enough. But then again, there needs to be some kind of finite limit because you can't spend the rest of your school year with your students answering the question or even just asking the question, is this good enough? Eventually you're going to have to come up with some kind of a practical answer. So how do you respond to that? What do you say to a student when they say, is this good enough? Do you say, no it isn't, try again, off you go, and send them away with a sad face, somewhat demotivated? Or can we come up with a better response? And you can see here that I'm using the usual advice that I give to students with how much glue, and that is make sure that you've got enough glue for 100% coverage, but not so much such that if I was to hold the joint up in the air like this, that it would run off and drip everywhere. And that looks about right. So, bearing in mind that my 2 outside faces with demo written on them are the ones that need to be facing the outside because that's the way the joint fits together, as we discovered in the last video, I'll now press these together. Now, before I do that, 2 things that I need to have on hand: my slightly damp rag and a tri-square, so that I can make sure that when I glue it and clamp it together, that it clamps square. That's really important. So here we go. Now, if this was really super tight fitting, there'd be glue everywhere. And you'll see here that even with this fit, there will actually be some glue that slides out. Hopefully not too much. Let's see how we go. And I can see it's already becoming more difficult to put together. And I need to have my slightly damp rag there so I don't get glue all over my fingers, because we don't want chemicals all over our fingers if we can help it. And there we go. Now as I try to clamp that together, that glue is going to want to come out a little bit more. So I just need to be mindful of that, which also makes this nice melamine surface good for gluing on because the glue doesn't stick to it particularly well. Now as I wiggle that joint around, you can see how the glue starts to want to come out. So as we're doing that, we can then start to think about how we're going to respond to that student's question. Is this good enough? Well, as I look at that, is this good enough? Well, one thing that you can ask is, well, what do you think? Turn the question back onto the student. Now, as I clamp this together, I'm going to use my tri-square here just to make sure that it gets clamped square, because as the glue dries, I want the glue to dry with the joint square. And because this is a fairly simple structure, it's only one corner, I only need one clamp. Usually this would be part of some kind of a four-sided structure, so this is a lot simpler. But by turning the question back on the student, well, what do you think? The first thing that does is it turns the student back to their criteria for success. And there's that strange phrase, criteria for success. Students often have a lot of trouble with that. What do you mean, criteria for success? It's important to emphasize again to the students that it's really just it's a simple concept. It's what does my project have to be in order for it to be successful? So in this case, one of the criteria to be successful is that the joint needs to be square. And reasonably free from gaps. And there's an interesting word, reasonably free from gaps. Well, how much is reasonably? And here we go down this rabbit hole of how good can this be? But the second thing that this does when you turn the question back on the student is that it helps to develop a sense of reflection. What am I actually doing and how well am I doing it? Actually, that's looking pretty good. The fourth thing I'd like to say about this is that by turning the question back onto the student, you haven't just looked at them and said, no, you're wrong, try again. That's likely to be very demotivating. Once the glue is dry, the joint can be sanded. I'm using a 120 grit to flatten any surface imperfections, but I'm not going to go any finer with the abrasive for this demonstration. This is one of those times when students think that they can simply sand away all their problems, but that's not usually the case. If the joint is properly made, then you can get an excellent result from this process. But if you've got excess pencil marks, or the joint isn't cut quite right, or if you've got gaps, then it's very difficult to try and bodge a fix with sanding. And here's the finished result. To keep this fairly raw and avoid covering too much up, I've left it at 120 grit, without applying any surface finishes or varnish. We'll just keep it nice and plain. On face value, it looks quite okay, but closer inspection will show you that this gap is actually quite pronounced and doesn't look that great. This could have been much tighter. And to improve upon this, you'd need to add filler and then sand and finish again. And as a craftsperson once told me, once you go down this line, the result just looks like mud. The other side kind of looks okay as well, but you can see here again that there are excess pencil lines that could have been removed and a bit of gappiness at the base of the tail. So, good enough? No, not really. But like I said at the beginning, here are two further demos, which I made to illustrate what better could look like. And now this comes back to the question, how good is good enough? Demo 2 looks better than Demo 1. And Demo 3 looks better than Demo 2. Could Demo 4 look better than Demo 3? If there was one. Probably. Possibly. But how many more demos do we need? And how many more before we then consider moving on to a different process altogether, like using a machine to cut the joints? Now, you might like to use this level of practice to give students the opportunity to fully understand the underlying principles before using a machining process for this joinery method, something like using a router and a dovetail jig. And the same line of thinking could apply to any joining method, or any kind of experimentation in the materials context. It's also important to remember that this is aimed at junior students. This is already quite a challenge for them, so it's a balance you'll need to find as you gauge their progress and how you might like to shape their expectations. And here we are, we have 3 finished demos. Now before we answer that question of is this good enough, we'll just say 3 quick technical things about this particular joint. Number 1, always use a face side and a face edge mark so that you know which way around the timbers go before you get halfway through the process and then start asking yourself the question, which way around does this go. Number 2 is to keep your pencil lines really nice and light, because as you can see, no matter how much you sand the job, the graphite pencil just kind of muddies the job. Now, you might be able to sand some of it away, but it's better if it's not there in the first place. And number 3, try to keep your marking and cutting as accurate as possible. And that kind of makes sense. Try to make sure that there are no gaps right from the start. So coming back to that question of, is this good enough? Well, generally the answer is going to be not really, because if it was ever good enough, we would have stopped innovating years ago. We would have stopped developing cars and phones and technology, sending rockets into space, or trying to nail that next recipe. But at some point, we need to move away from the philosophical with the student, as in not always turning the question back on them, and actually give them some concrete examples to relate to, because otherwise they're just going to start getting impatient. Can't you just tell me the answer? And that's fair enough. Using these 3 demo models, you can then invite the student to match theirs against one of these 3 and then say, well, I think mine matches this one, or it matches this one, or actually, no, I think it's really good and I think it matches your demo 3, and in fact, I think it's even better. And you might say, yeah, I think yours is actually better than that one as well, or maybe not, but you get the idea. And that's why having 3 demos with a range of different results can help to just bring that whole thing into a much more concrete reality for the student. And I think that's going to end up being a much better resource for you to have in the workshop, rather than just constantly having this discussion of, well, what do you think? Do you think you could make it better? Because at some point, you have to be able to move on. You can't keep asking that question forever about one project. You can keep asking that question about subsequent projects as you work towards continuous improvement. But at some point, you have to be able to move on. So I hope you found that helpful, because we've covered quite a lot of detail in this particular video. So thanks very much for watching it all the way to the end, and we'll see you in the next one.